Everyone who attended the 2002 Friars Club roast of Chevy Chase already hated him before they sat down. That is not how roasts work. The Friars tradition requires the roasters to love the person in the chair, the cruelty to be affectionate, the room to be full of friends, settling scores they have agreed to laugh about. None of that was present. The roasters, Todd Barry, Richard Belzer, Stephen Colbert, Al Franken, Greg Giraldo, Lisa Lampanelli, Mark Maron, were not Chevy's friends. He did not recognize most of them. Afterward, he asked a producer why no famous people had been invited. The producer told him that famous people had been invited and that every single one of them had said no. Steve Martin and Martin Short sent a video instead of attending. They explained as a joke that they didn't have his new number. The joke hit differently than it might have because in the years since they lost that number, Martin and Short had made several films together. Without him, Stephen Colbert delivered the line that defined the evening. He stepped into Chevy's perspective and spoke from inside it, a humorless husk of my former self haunting the halls of Hollywood, like some sort of walking, waking cautionary tale, just sucking the joy out of everything I touch. Chevy sat in the chair with sunglasses on. He said later that his eyes were tearing underneath them. He said he was thinking they really believe this stuff. He was born Cornelius Crane Chase on October 8, 1943 in Lower Manhattan, into a family whose connection to American wealth and social position was real and complicated, and a source of embarrassment that he carried publicly for decades. His mother, Kathleen Parker, had named him after her adoptive father, Cornelius Vanderbilt Crane, who ran the Crane Plumbing Company and who controlled a fortune that Kathleen hoped would eventually reach her and her children. It did not. Cornelius Crane disowned her in his will, and she received nothing, and Chevy grew up in the specific condition of a family that had proximity to wealth without the wealth itself, which produces in certain children a relationship to social performance that is at once practiced and anxious. He would later describe his upbringing as upper middle class, which was an accurate description of some of it and a recalibration of other parts. He bought a Rolls-Royce with the inheritance he did receive, which was the act of a man who had been adjacent to the Vanderbilt fortune long enough to understand its aesthetic grammar, even if the inheritance itself was modest. The childhood was not comfortable in ways that the social position, such as it was, could not address. He has described being woken in the middle of the night by his mother, who slapped him repeatedly across the face, and who on other occasions sent him outside to select branches from a tree with which she would then hit him for whatever infraction had been determined. At 14, he pulled a knife on another student at the Riverdale Country School and was suspended, and his mother locked him in the cellar with a mattress, a pitcher, a desk, a small lamp, and 2 windows 1.5 feet high with bars on them. The confinement ended when he was expelled from Riverdale, which removed him from the family's immediate environment and deposited him at the Stockbridge School in Massachusetts, where the distance from home functioned as the first reliable structure he had encountered. He became valedictorian. He went to Bard College, where he played piano and drums and keyboard in a band called Chameleon Church, and where he chose not to attend medical school, and where he discovered that not attending medical school made him eligible for the Vietnam draft. He handled the draft the way he would handle many subsequent problems in his life, with improvisation that was creative enough to work, and that revealed something about his relationship to the rules other people were expected to follow. He cited homosexual tendencies to the draft board. Before his physical, he stayed awake for 2 consecutive nights and made needle marks on his arm to suggest intravenous drug use. He was classified 4F, not qualified for any military service, and he was free. The solution was effective and dishonest, and probably would have destroyed him professionally if it had come out at the time, and it did not come out at the time, and he moved on. The move to New York after Bard had not immediately produced results. He worked as a waiter and a taxi driver, and in other jobs that kept him close to the city where the work he wanted was being done without putting him inside it. He wrote. He performed in small venues. He absorbed the specific education of someone who is in the right place but has not yet found the right door, which is an education that either produces patience or bitterness depending on which side of it you are currently on. He was on the patient side of it longer than his public persona would later suggest. The National Lampoon, work the radio hour. The Lemmings stage show. These were not overnight arrivals. They were the product of years of positioning himself close enough to the right rooms that when the right room opened, he was already standing next to it. John Belushi was in the Lemmings show. Their dynamic, which was immediately combustible and immediately productive, set the template for the Saturday Night Live ensemble before the show existed. Two people with entirely different approaches to chaos. Belushi running toward it, and Chevy managing it from a position of studied superiority, who together generated something that neither produced alone. He found the National Lampoon Group, which was the door, and he walked through it at full speed, and by the time Saturday Night Live arrived in 1975, he had been preparing for that room for years without knowing the room existed. He went to Los Angeles and wrote episodes for the Smothers Brothers show and met a young comic magician named Steve Martin and joined the National Lampoon Group in 1973, performing in its radio hour and in the Lemmings stage show where he first worked with John Belushi. The Lampoon connection led directly to Saturday Night Live. And Saturday Night Live on October 11th, 1975, was the night that everything became possible. He was 32 years old. He ran the cold open of the first episode. He invented the Weekend Update segment. In his first year, he won 2 Emmy Awards, and his confidence at the ceremonies was so complete that he waited on stage for his name to be announced, rather than remaining in his seat like the other nominees, because he already knew he was going to win. The move was either prophetic or insufferable, depending on your position relative to it, and it was both, and he did not see a distinction worth observing between the two. The cocaine arrived alongside the success, which was not unusual in that industry at that moment. He has written about it in his authorized biography, I'm Chevy Chase and You're Not, with the specific combination of candor and rationalization that characterizes addiction memoirs written by people who have not fully reckoned with what they are describing. He described receiving his Emmy coming off stage and having Red Fox put a spoonful of cocaine up his nose and called it a common way of expressing joy. He said he was in control, never out of control, and the subsequent decades provided the extended evidence against that claim. The cocaine did not produce the problems by itself. The problems were already present in the architecture of the personality, in the gap between the boy who had been hit in the cellar and the man who had decided that the best response to a world that had initially refused to accommodate him was to refuse to accommodate it in return at volume with an audience. His film career, after SNL, was built on a run of commercial successes that the industry interpreted as the foundation of something durable. Foul play. In 1978, Caddyshack in 1980, the Vacation franchise beginning in 1983, Fletch in 1985. 3 of his first 4 post-SNL films combined for $100 million in box office returns, against $11 million in budgets. New York Magazine suggested he might replace Johnny Carson. Johnny Carson's response, that Chevy couldn't ad-lib a fart after a baked bean dinner, was the kind of dismissal that lands when it contains enough truth to stick, and it stuck, and the public argument about whether it was accurate or not was itself a form of attention that Chevy had never had to compete for before. The Vacation films made him the center of a franchise that generated genuine affection in the American audience. A family comedy series that understood something about the gap between what family trips are supposed to be and what they actually are, and which gave Chevy a character, Clark Griswold, whose delusion about his own competence was funny rather than painful because it was contained within a fiction that everyone agreed to. Clark Griswold's certainty that he could manage everything was permitted to be charming because it was a movie. Chevy's certainty that he could manage everything was permitted to be charming for approximately the same length of time, and then was not. Fletch, in 1985, was the other film that demonstrated what he could do when the material was matched precisely to his specific gifts, which were comic timing, physical confidence, and the ability to deliver an absurd line with a straightness that made the absurdity funnier than it would have been if he had acknowledged it. Fletch Irwin Fletcher, a journalist in disguise working multiple identities simultaneously, was the closest the films came to capturing what was actually interesting about Chevy Chase at full capability. The sequel never materialized despite years of announcements, and the industry's periodic inability to produce the sequel was a small but accurate index of how his relationships with studios and producers tended to develop over time, which was productively and then not. He left SNL after the first season, which was the decision that the cast and crew who remained never entirely forgave, not because leaving was wrong, but because of how he characterized it. He told people he had other things to do. He suggested in various ways across the following decades that the show had been elevated by his presence and diminished by his departure, and that the first year remained the standard against which all subsequent seasons should be measured, which happened to be the year in which he was the central figure. Lorne Michaels watched this narrative develop and did not publicly correct it, and Chevy returned to host the show 7 times, which is a number that reflects the audience's affection for the franchise version of him rather than the industry's enthusiasm for the actual person. The behavior that produced the 2002 roast had been accumulating for 2 decades before the roast provided its formal inventory. He verbally abused producers on multiple productions. On the set of Community, which he joined in 2009 playing Pierce Hawthorne, an egotistical and curmudgeonly millionaire, he inhabited with a precision that suggested either genuine craft or the simple efficiency of playing a version of yourself at close range. He told an actress on the show what he wanted to do to her dead body in what he apparently framed as a compliment. In Joel McHale's memoir, Thanks for the Money, the incident involving the same actress was described in terms that left no interpretive room about whether it was acceptable. A comedian named Rob Hubel introduced himself to Chevy at an event and said that Chevy was his comedy hero. Chevy slapped him across the face, hard enough that Hubel saw red. The incident became the kind of story that circulates in the industry without ever quite rising to the level of consequence, because the industry in that era had a specific threshold for consequence that was considerably higher than it is now, and that Chevy stayed just below for most of his career. The Community years produced the most documented version of the pattern. Donald Glover and Dan Harmon discussed his racial remarks on the show in terms that were simultaneously explicit and designed to be deniable, describing him as probably the least racist guy while providing the specific evidence that complicated that description. When an actress named Yvette Nicole Brown refused to continue working until Chevy apologized for something he had said to her, and the director raised the issue, Chevy's response invoked his friendship with Richard Pryor as exculpatory context. The specific language he reported using with Pryor and the specific conclusion he drew from that friendship about what was permissible with other people was recorded and discussed and added to the file that the industry was building without formally acknowledging it was building. The rap party at the end of Season 3 produced the voicemail. Dan Harmon allegedly started a chant directed at Chevy as a way of acknowledging the cast and crew's endurance. Chevy left. He then left a voicemail for Harmon that Harmon played publicly at a live show in which Chevy told Harmon he could perform a sexual act on himself and that he would kick his teeth out if given the opportunity, and that Harmon was not funny, only okay. The voicemail was specific and extended and produced in the particular register of a man who believes the record will vindicate him and is wrong about that. Pierce Hawthorne was killed off in the following season. Chevy's character on the show he had joined, because he was blown away by Dan Harmon's writing, was removed from the series by the man whose writing had blown him away through the mechanism of fictional death, which is the most complete available form of professional conclusion. He attempted to return to SNL. At his daughter's wedding, while waiting to walk her down the aisle, he told Lorne Michaels he was ready to host again. The setting of the request is worth holding on to. He was at his daughter's wedding in the specific emotional context of a parent handing a child to the next chapter of her life, and what he communicated to Lorne Michaels in that moment was not something about the wedding, but something about himself, about the show he had left 50 years earlier and the position he believed he still occupied within it. Michaels declined. The request and the refusal happened at a wedding, and both of them proceeded with the ceremony, and the nature of what had just passed between them went unaddressed, as it had been going unaddressed in various forms for most of a career. Michaels declined. During SNL's 50th anniversary celebration in 2025, Chevy was not invited onto the stage. He said afterward that he had expected to be up there with the other cast members from the early years, that no one had asked him, and that he did not understand why. The answer was available to him. He had been told the answer at the 2002 roast and in the voicemail that Harmon played publicly and in every interaction across 50 years in which the people around him had attempted to communicate what they were experiencing. The answer was not a mystery. He simply did not accept it as information that applied to him. A documentary about him was released in 2026. It attempted to locate the real person behind the public record, the man underneath the behavior, the wound under the wound. The premise of that kind of documentary is that access and honesty from the subject will produce understanding in the audience that the explanation of how someone became what they became is sufficient to account for what they are. The documentary produced a director who said she had never been treated so rudely by an interview subject, which is not the outcome that premise usually generates, and which is perhaps the most concentrated version of Chevy Chase's entire story, which is that the attempt to understand him tends to produce more evidence of the thing it was trying to explain. The director, Marina Zinovich, came out of the filming saying she had never done an interview in which the subject was so rude to her. Martin Short and Lorne Michaels participated. Steve Martin and Christopher Guest declined. Every member of the Community cast declined. He has said across multiple interviews that he has already done what he has done and cannot change anything, and is proud to be who he is. What do you think his story reveals about what Hollywood chooses to tolerate, and for how long? Let us know in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and we will see you in the next one.